That's well. Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Jackie Jacob. I am the one of the 2 poultry specialists here at the University of Kentucky. And I also, as part of my job, do the coordination for the small and backyard flocks community of practice on e-extension, which is the electronic version of the National Cooperative Extension Service. And as part of that, we do our monthly webinars. This month's webinar is on whether or not to vaccinate. And we have Alicia Halbritter, is that right? Halbritter from, close enough, okay, from the, from the Florida Extension Service is going to give us an overview of whether or not you should vaccinate your backyard flocks. So it's all yours.
It says
no, okay, I gotta allow sharing. Yeah, okay. There you go. I will be on mute. If anyone has any questions, just type it in the chat box and I will monitor it, or you can chat or put it in the Q&A box. If the question is pertinent to what she is talking about at the time, I will interrupt and ask the question. Otherwise, I'll hold them till the end. So you can do the Q&A box or the chat box. I'll be on mute during the presentation, but we'll be monitoring questions.
Thanks, Jackie. So like she said, my name is Alicia Halbritter. I am an Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent in Baker County, Florida, which is just west of Jacksonville. So the northeast corner over here by the ocean. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about vaccinating backyard poultry. Is it necessary? How do we determine whether or not that's something we should be doing? So the first thing to consider when you're thinking about backyard poultry is pretty much anything when we're looking at poultry or any livestock is it's going to depend. When we're particularly talking about vaccinations, it's going to depend on one main factor, and that is, do you have a closed or an open flock? And those terms may not be familiar to you, so I'll explain them a little bit further. Most people are probably going to fall into that label of a closed flock, which means you have your birds, you're not moving those birds in and out of your property, you're not continuously buying more birds, especially adult birds or anything, and bringing them onto the property, integrating them into your flock. If you do buy new birds, per se, if you're getting new chicks every spring or so, that those birds are quarantined for at least a 14-day period before they're interacting with your long-standing flock. Obviously, the longer we can quarantine them, the better. And with chicks, typically they're going to be quarantined anyways from an adult flock because we're not mixing new chicks with our adults. They're going to be quarantined in a brooder area, for 8 or 9 weeks, maybe longer, depending on what time of year you're doing it. And you don't typically personally handle or interact with other birds. So you're not going over to friends' houses. You're not a poultry judge that's interacting with fairs and handling other people's poultry specifically, but even sometimes other birds can carry diseases that can come back to our chickens. So if you're not handling any other avian species, for your friends, even if it's just like a short interaction, we would consider that a closed flock. An open flock is pretty much anything that's the opposite of a closed flock. So the most easy explanation of that is you frequently have birds entering and leaving your property, whether that be show birds that you are taking to fairs or shows and exhibiting, or whether that be you are buying and selling birds. So particularly if you're selling birds, selling chicks that you're hatching out, even if those are incubated birds versus, sat on the nest by a hen or so. If you're selling anything or bringing chicks or adult hens into your flock, we would consider you an open flock. It also depends on some other things like flock size. If you have a flock at your house of 100 or more chickens, you might be more inclined to vaccinate those birds because it's more of an expense for you if something of a disease outbreak were to happen versus your really small flocks where you may have 5, 10, maybe even 20 birds. If something were to happen in the course that you would be required to depopulate that flock, which would be completely killing off that flock, or if some birds were to succumb to a disease that we have vaccinations for, it wouldn't necessarily be a huge investment for you to replace those birds per se. The housing environment's going to be really dependent on whether vaccinations are going to be required or not. So how clean is your coop? What kind of spacing requirements are there for your birds? And is it, like we're talking meat bird brooder housing type, or are we talking your typical layer hen coop, chicken coop, backyard kind of environment? That could change whether or not, how easily your birds may be transmit those diseases. And so that might can factor in some decisions on whether or not we should vaccinate, particularly the exposure to wild birds or vector-borne diseases like those brought on by mosquitoes and rats, because those are what our flocks are going to be exposed to the most. If wild birds are getting into your coop and have the ability to nest in there or eating your food and such, and if they're outdoors and open to mosquitoes in the open air, they have a lot more likelihood of getting diseases. So you have to be really aware of whether or not vaccinations are going to apply in those situations. We do have a number of vaccines available for poultry. Most of these are pretty much all for chickens. Some of them do apply for turkeys and a little bit for waterfowl as well. Most of these vaccinations are going to be recommended for chickens, and a few of them select are for poultry or turkeys, and there's a few additional ones for turkeys as well, but they're not as common. So those vaccines are going to be for Marek's disease, foulpox, mycoplasmas, Newcastle's, coccidiosis, and salmonella. So how do you decide whether or not you need these vaccines, or they're beneficial to you or not? So the difficulty with self-vaccinations is our system really isn't set up for it because typically backyard people are not vaccinating their birds. So ordering the vaccines is kind of difficult. They're not available from a lot of retailers. You almost always have to have them shipped. It's very rare you'll find them available in a local feed store or Tractor Supply, anything of that sort. Most of these vaccines are considered live vaccines, not killed vaccines, and therefore they do need to stay chilled and refrigerated. So delivery becomes a huge issue, considering, in Florida, it's 90 to 100 degrees right now. We obviously don't have air-conditioned mail trucks. So if those delivery times are getting to 3 or 4 days or longer, we're having difficulties getting our vaccines in the time period that we need them by for them to stay good and refrigerated in that delivery package. The dosage is probably the most difficult issue that we have with backyard poultry because, again, most backyard owners are not vaccinating their own birds, and therefore the commercial industry is the #1 purchaser of vaccines, and they're vaccinating thousands of birds at a time. So most of these vaccines you'll find available are in vials of 5,000 to 10,000 doses. So although they may be quite affordable, some of them are only $30 or so a vial. Some of them get into hundreds of dollars a vial, but it's a lot of waste of expense for us because we may only be using 5 to 10, maybe even a couple hundred of those thousands of doses. And so you're paying for all the extra for no reason because they are live vaccines. Some of them do have to be mixed on site, and then they're only good for an hour or so. After that, these aren't vaccines that you can typically store for a long period of time and use for multiple, flock transitions or such. So that's probably the #1 issue for small flocks. Administering them can be somewhat difficult. There are 3, sometimes 4 typical transmission methods or administration methods of these vaccines. One of those being subcutaneous, so right under the skin. One of those being wing web injection, so it doesn't go in the bone or the muscle. or any tendons or anything in the wing, but just in that fleshy area. And then we have a couple of vaccines that can be administered through the feed in the water. Those obviously are going to be fairly catered to commercial industries because they have a lot more accurate dosing, feeding, and watering abilities to inject vaccines into those than, say, a backyard person. So it can be difficult to accurately administer those vaccines and make sure that each bird is getting the accurate dose required. And then the timing of those is difficult as well. Some of these vaccines are administered on day 1. Some of them are administered on week 14. Some of them are administered in week 18. So if you're selling birds, especially like hatching out chicks and selling them, it's going to be hard for you to vaccinate them because we're not keeping those chicks for 18 weeks or so. So you're not going to be able to vaccinate them for some of the specific diseases. If you're keeping those birds, obviously you can vaccinate them at any point in time during that life cycle when the recommended vaccinations is. Some of them also require boosters or more than one dose, and that just factors into that timing of how your operation is running and whether or not you're going to be keeping these birds and have access to them to administer that second dose. So the short answer is backyard poultry owners are probably not going to vaccinate. It's probably not necessary for you for a number of reasons. One, most backyard people are probably purchasing from a commercial hatchery. Even if you're getting from your local feed store or Tractor Supply, all of those chicks are coming from a commercial hatchery. And most of those hatcheries are vaccinating for at least a few of the diseases listed here. So those ones marketed specifically for backyard poultry owners may have at least one or two of our major vaccines, like Merrick's, maybe even Fowlpox as well. Many diseases are not endemic to areas around the United States, so the vaccines aren't really necessary. Take Newcastle bronchitis, for example. It was pretty much almost eradicated through most of the United States. We do have a few hot areas in like Arizona and California where they've had some more issues with that, but that disease is just not really prevalent. So here down in Florida, I would never recommend someone to vaccinate their birds or feel that that's necessary unless those birds are traveling a lot and interacting with a lot of other birds or being handled through that. Your typical backyard person is never going to encounter Newcastle's disease in most of the US. So those vaccines are just not really necessary. Again, the vaccines are somewhat expensive. They're sold in large doses, which is not really suitable for small flocks. So even if we wanted to vaccinate, it would be really difficult for us if we're, again, raising our own birds. And I think the number one thing about these vaccines that we have to be aware of when we're talking about diseases, particularly fatal diseases, is a lot of these vaccines, they may prevent death of the bird, but they do not prevent infection or spread of that disease, and sometimes don't even prevent symptoms. So they may lessen the symptoms, may make it less likely for your birds to die. But if you have very expensive show birds and you're thinking about vaccinating them, well, even if they become positive, it's not a good habit for you to be taking that positive bird. They may not have died for that disease, but now they're potentially infecting and spreading that disease to other birds. So we definitely don't want to use vaccines as a way to say that our poultry are just 100% protected. They're safe from any disease because, again, they can still be infected. They can still be carriers of that disease. And, in some instances, we would want them to be able to show symptoms, particularly for our more troublesome diseases, so we know we need to depopulate that flock and that they are carriers. It's more worrisome to me to know that a bird could potentially be infected and spreading that disease and not show any symptoms, be asymptomatic. And then again, we would never know and we would just be contributing to the spread of that disease. So we have to be really careful with something like that. So what can you do as a backyard poultry owner since you aren't able to vaccinate? You can certainly purchase these vaccines. I know for sure like Valley Vet and Jeffers and a few online retailers do sell a number of these vaccines that you can purchase just kind of over the counter. They don't require a veterinarian. Some of them do require a veterinarian, so just be aware of that. But in general, as a backyard flock owner, you should be focusing on biosecurity. So closing your flock would be the best option. Obviously, if you're showing birds and that's your hobby, or selling birds and that's your business, you're not going to be interested in closing your flock. But if you have an almost closed flock, just be really conscious about your interaction with other birds and such. Keep your coop clean. That's a really good way to reduce transmission from vectors like mosquitoes and such, and prevent that exposure to wild animals, particularly wild birds. Don't allow your animals to have little sparrows and such nesting in the coop, although it's really cute and such, but those birds are just potential carriers of disease, so we want to make sure we're not interacting with them. Mosquito control is going to be the biggest factor, because most of these diseases are carried by mosquitoes and transmissible from one bird to the other through those mosquitoes. So mosquito control is a great way to increase the biosecurity of your operation. And then in the end, your veterinarians are always going to know best. Speak with your veterinarian. If you don't have a veterinarian, find one that knows about poultry, knows about your flock, and can give you the best recommendations, particularly if you have a very open flock, if you're moving birds in and out constantly, or if you're in an area with endemic diseases like Newcastle's in the Western United States. So those veterinarians are going to have a lot more experience. They're going to know specific to what your situation is and what's going to be the best for your flock, and how you should manage that. So when to consider those vaccinations, again, if you have an open flock, all birds in an open flock should be vaccinated regardless if they are coming and leaving the operation or not. Your vet can advise what vaccines would be the best for your area and needs. Again, that disease in your geographic area. So in the examples of Newcastle's disease, that's very, constrained to specific geographic locations. Those are the birds that need to be vaccinated. And a lot of these diseases can also be found in the soils and on equipment and such, and live for 6 months and sometimes even longer. So if your flock has a previous experience with past outbreaks, then those new birds should definitely be vaccinated in order to give them an extra boost of immunity to combat any potential disease that could be found in the area. If you don't have any of these factors, so you have a closed flock, there's not a disease outbreak in your area, and you don't have any past experience with outbreaks, it's really not necessary for you to consider vaccinating your birds. And again, you want to be sure that your birds haven't already been vaccinated if you purchased them from a commercial hatchery where they likely received 1 or 2 vaccines already. So it's kind of a quick talk today, just to give you a little answer to one of the main questions we get about backyard poultry and whether vaccinations are necessary or not. It's not really a whole lot of in-depth stuff I can talk to you about, since our general recommendation is you really don't have to and you don't need to. You're welcome to give me a call. I am on the Eastern time zone, so just be aware of that if you're calling my office. Email is the best way to get a hold of me in regards to poultry questions or such, and I'd be happy to either answer your question or find someone in your area that knows about your specific needs for your geographic location and your extension system there. Any health questions should be directed towards your veterinarian, though. We are not legally allowed to give any health recommendations as far as treatments or anything of that sort, medication. So make sure you're directing all those questions towards your vet and not your local extension service. And with that, I will take any questions, Jackie.
Okay, so does anybody have any questions? You can type it in the chat box or in the Q&A box. While you're thinking about your questions, I'll just mention that next month's webinar is, I believe, on getting ready for the winter. It's hard to think that we're already preparing for the winter. That will be September the 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern time. October 5th is raising guinea fowl. You can always see what the upcoming webinars are by looking at our webinar page. We also have articles on a variety of different topics, including the immune system. So if one wants to check those out. And we also have a Facebook page that is specifically for small and backyard flocks that you can join. We put news there, or upcoming webinars, recordings. This webinar is recorded, and the recordings are available on our YouTube page. Would you kindly share the name of your Facebook page? It is Poultry Extension. Oops. Unless you have a specific one that you would, how to find your old webinars, please. If you go to the webinar link there will be a link to the past webinars. They're all there. There are many of them that you can look at. Any other questions? Oh, no, that's Q&A. Oh, never mind, it's done. I heard that in the UK, there was an outbreak of bird flu and whole flocks have been culled. What is the likelihood of bird flu in the US? We should probably do a webinar on bird flu, but the avian influenza is a topic in itself. You can't vaccinate for avian influenza in the United States, but they monitor for it here, and the chances of it are low that you would get it. How do you clean a pen? Is a question for you.
So there's a number of ways. It will highly depend on how your pen is set up. For me, I typically use wood shavings, and so I'm going to take out all of those shavings. In my coop area, I pressure wash my entire coop. You can use disinfectants depending on your needs or what your operation looks like. That could be diluted bleach, things like that. The requirement or necessary of that's really something you're gonna have to determine on your own. And if you have like a run or somewhere that's just an enclosed area, it's really good to go in there and clean out some debris every now and then. You can scoop poop or add more soil and stuff on top of that just so it's a cleaner run. I know a lot of people use sand, and basically it functions as a litter box type of cleaning system. So it's really just removing any manure that's there is the number one thing of cleaning a pen. Cleaning out nest boxes, making sure they're not storing any fly eggs and things like that are going to be the biggest issue. And then not necessarily just removing that from the coop, but removing it from your operation, composting it, moving it far enough away from the coop where it's not going to just come back and interact with those chickens in general.
Especially if you're letting your chickens run free into them.
Yeah, chickens are really great about kind of just clearing out, any insect larvae and eggs and such like that, but you do have to be conscious of that. And if you're having issues with mites and lice and things that can be vectors of disease as well, particularly from wild birds, if they're getting them from wild birds, there are some specific cleaning methods you have to take to treat those, so which are insecticides.
I think we did have a webinar a while back on cleaning and disinfecting your poultry facility, I think. So there may be a recording there that you could watch. Perfect. On that one. Are there any other questions? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much, Alicia. You did a great job again. Again, this recording will be up if you want to watch it again to see if you fall into that should I or shouldn't I vaccinate type question. If you have fowl pox, maybe you need to worry about that, but see if you can find a local veterinarian that will help you out. Maybe your local extension office can help you find a local veterinarian that will do it. And hopefully we'll see you next week. Next month when we talk about getting ready for the winter. So everybody have a good evening, and I'll see you in a month, I hope. Thank you, Alicia.
Thanks so much, Jackie.